allow me to invite on stage Mr. Philip Shallikens, Senior Economist in the East Asia Region's Poverty Reduction and Economic Management Unit, to present the key findings of the report.
Good afternoon, or perhaps I should also say good evening. The Malaysia Economic Monitor is an economic update, but it's also a piece of research. Let me start with the economic update and briefly review the recent economic developments, and then I will talk about the near and medium-term economic outlook. After that, I will cover the topic of brain drain. So let me first start talking about how has the economy, the Malaysian economy, been performing after the global economic and financial crisis. And I will just show you the data. The data is current as of the middle of April, approximately. You will see that most of the charts don't have any sources. That's because we made all the data up. So, but actually, all the sources will be in the Malaysia Economic Monitor. You can get a hard copy after the presentation. So let's briefly have a look at how has the economy, how has growth momentum been evolving over the last couple of quarters. Now, the Department of Statistics does not publish sequential data that is seasonally adjusted, but that's really what we need to look at to understand how momentum evolves. And if you look at the left chart here, that really summarizes what has happened over the last couple of years. The crisis produced a very sharp contraction in growth, but then the rebound was equally pronounced. After that, Malaysia experienced a period of robust sequential growth, but then in 2010, last year, things started to decelerate to slower growth rates. Initially, in the last Malaysia Economic Monitor, we thought that this was part of a normalization process towards more sustainable growth rates. After a rebound, robust growth, and things eventually start to slow down. But actually it turned out that the slowing of momentum started to transform itself into a contraction in the third quarter. This was due to a temporary weakness in global demand, but luckily growth quickly re-emerged as export orders from both the industrial and emerging economies revived in the final quarter. So for the year as a whole, the economy grew actually by 7.2% in 2010, after contracting 1.7% in 2009. And this robust recovery was driven by private consumption, private fixed investment, and there was also a process of fiscal consolidation. Exports picked up favorably, but imports rebounded more forcefully as a result of solid domestic demand. So, in a nutshell, the recovery in 2010 was characterized by a transition from external and public sources of growth to domestic private sources of growth. Now, recent indicators suggest that momentum continues to be strong. Industrial production and capacity utilization over the last couple of months have turned out at healthy rates. Now, let's put this in perspective and let's have a look at a chart on the right-hand side. That shows the seasonally adjusted GDP levels. And if we look at the latest observation for the last quarter of 2010, we see that the recovery from the crisis is totally complete. Malaysia's GDP level is now some 6.3% above what it was when the crisis started. But if we were to assume that the crisis had not happened, we would have assumed a reasonable growth rate to be, or historical growth rates to be sustained over this period, then we are still falling short of what might have happened by some 9.2%. So in other words, the losses of the crisis seem to be permanent. Now, for Malaysia to recover those losses is going to be difficult because we now have a new normal. Advanced economies are growing less quickly than before. So recovering those losses would require really rapid economic growth that may not be feasible. But let's talk about that more when we discuss the medium-term challenges. During the period under review, the solid economic performance of the Malaysian economy was also accompanied by a build-up in inflationary pressures. month-on-month inflation, which is again the relative metric to look at, not year on year, has been on a steady rise since the middle of 2010, and this was mainly due to international food prices, but also subsidy cuts on certain food items such as sugar also play a role. A wide range of food items have seen their prices rise very quickly in recent months, such as meats, vegetables, fruits, sugar, and eggs. On the right-hand side, though, we can see that CPI inflation, consumer price inflation, in Malaysia is still much lower than in other regional economies. Although actually, if you look at producer price inflation, the opposite is true. So Malaysia actually has one of the highest inflation rates in the region. Why is that the case? Well, it's the price control and subsidization schemes here probably play a role. Also, currency appreciation has helped keeping the prices under control. Now, the low levels of consumer price inflation so far don't really mean that it's not a cause for concern. Well, first of all, it can show up in the fiscal accounts. And second of all, when you need to evaluate it relative to the history of inflation. The history of inflation in Malaysia has been relatively subdued. So the sudden pickup in inflation can actually have a disproportionate effect on consumer spending, and this is indeed a downside risk if inflationary pressures were to continue to build. Now let's talk quickly about exports. And what we have done here is, and I'm just picking a couple of messages that we have in the report. We picked a couple of countries here, or places: Hong Kong, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Taiwan. These were also the economies that were very much affected by the global economic crisis. So the 6 economies here all faced an economic recession at some point during 2008-2009. We can see on the left-hand side, which is showing export levels, the volume of exports expressed in US dollar. We can see that the recovery in export volumes in all of these crisis economies was actually relatively synchronized. Exports plunged and then they rebounded very quickly. But Malaysia seems to have underperformed here. The level in January 2011, and this is an index here, was only 17% higher than the pre-crisis level in January 2007. Whereas for the other economies, the level in January 2011 was 30% higher. So it seems that Malaysia has lacked the export recovery that has been observed in the other countries, which could point to a structural loss in competitiveness. Let's look at this in more detail. On the right-hand side, we focus at the electrical and electronics industry. We see that and this sector accounts for about 40% of Malaysia's total exports. We see that after rebounding over the course of 2009, the sector in Malaysia has remained stagnant, and that's quite different compared to other countries such as China, Indonesia, and Korea. And it seems if you look more deeply into the EME industry, some subsectors have actually remained relatively strong, but the weakness is really accounted for by the parts and components trade. Now this in itself, I mean, we need to always interpret this information. This in itself is perhaps nothing to worry so much about, because these are also sort of standardized commodities where competition based on cost is very important. And we have to also remember that Malaysia is trying to move up the value chains. What will matter now is that indeed this moving up the value chain processes is proceeding, so that industries that will have to be ceded to lower cost countries can be replaced by industries where Malaysia can compete based upon value, high value, driven by innovation and creativity rather than low cost. Another interesting factoid about the recent economic developments is the performance of FDI. We all know, I mean, based on the UNCTAD figures, that 2009 was a very bad year all around the world. FDI plunged in Malaysia in 2009 but also the FDI inflows rebounded very favorably in 2010. So these are the BNN statistics: 1.4 billion in 2009 and 8.6 billion in 2010. Now, we did a little piece of analysis in our monitor to point out that actually Malaysia, there's a huge untapped potential for FDI. And it seems that Malaysia has in a way underperformed relative to that potential. We simulated a model and we looked at FDI from 24 OECD countries for which we had data available in a consistent way. And we looked at the FDI flows into the ASEAN 5: Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, and Singapore. And based on these simulations, and then we look at factors of the sending country, factors of the receiving country, and we look at a number of policy variables. One of the policy variables is the openness of investment policies. Another policy variable was the innovation ecosystem, the skills base, and that was measured by the number of patents per person in the country. We estimate a relationship, and based on that relationship, we see that Malaysia should have attracted during 2007 and to 2009 for these 24 OECD countries some 5.5 billion US dollar, where the actual performance was 3.8. Now, the interesting thing here is that if you improve the policy variables, you would see that in this counterfactual scenario, potential FDI would be much larger. That's the partial improvement scenario. Now, if we go to best practice within the sample, and the best practice values can be obtained by looking at the investment climate in Singapore, then Malaysian FDI, controlling for the other characteristics of Malaysia, would have been 15.3, which is some 5 times larger than actual FDI over the period considered. Now, these comparisons are, of course, subject to uncertainty, but we firmly believe that they are nevertheless telling. And Malaysia could make further progress in terms of opening up, particularly its services sector, and a lot of benefits could be reaped by attracting further FDI. Now, quality FDI is more important than quantity of FDI. But we have to remember that Singapore, as it became a high-income economy, it also relied a lot on FDI in the services in the industries. So while the values of individual FDI, foreign direct investments, may have become smaller, Singapore managed to attract just many more of them. So on the whole, the total volume of FDI was also going up as Singapore progressed. This is not to say that Malaysia's future development should be based on FDI only. I think we think it would be equally, if not more important, to develop indigenous capabilities so that small and medium enterprises can grow and can access the international markets directly. So let me now turn to the outlook for growth, and I will look briefly at the near-term outlook and then offer some views about the medium and long-term outlook. And you will notice that, as in the previous Malaysia Economic Monitor, there are some dark clouds on the horizon. But this is just a coincidence and has nothing to do with what I'm going to say next. In the near term, we have just updated our forecast. These are our most recent forecasts. So we see the economy rebound to 7.2% in 2010, and we predict that growth in the coming year should resume at reasonable rates comparable to the pre-crisis episodes. Growth is projected at 5.3% in 2011 and 5.5% in 2012. Now, these are slightly better forecasts than what we had back in November, and that's also because the assumptions have generally improved. But external demand continues to remain fragile. So what we expect is that domestic demand is going to be the key driver of growth propelling the Malaysian economy, particularly private consumption and fixed investment as fiscal consolidation hopefully moves forward. We also price in the gradual but less than complete implementation of the structural reform agenda. And we also consider the impact of intensifying competition in the region for trade, for talent, for FDI. And we also price in the fact that for some of the advanced economies, growth is actually going to slow down in the next period, particularly in the European Union. For the US, it remains relatively flat. And for most of the emerging economies, our forecasts suggest that there's going to be a moderation in growth momentum. So that justifies why our growth forecast for this year is around 5.3%. Among the key downside risks in the near term, we see the recovery, the still uncertain recovery in global demand. At the moment, we live in a world out of balance. There is a divergence in economic performance between advanced economies and emerging economies. Within the advanced economies, there's a huge divergence between the US and Europe. And within Europe, there's a huge divergence between the poor countries in Europe and the peripheral countries. And this is expected to continue, and hopefully it doesn't get accentuated further, because that would affect the growth prospects for Malaysia. If inflationary pressure were to build up further, then this could also present a risk for Malaysia in terms of private consumption, which we assume is going to be the key propeller of growth over the next coming years. The failure to achieve fiscal consolidation is also an important risk, and may put into question the government's commitment towards the reform agenda. Although the level of public debt at the moment may not be of immediate concern, it does limit the government's ability to cope with any future adverse shocks. And lackluster progress on the fiscal consolidation front could also hurt policy credibility that may spill over into perceptions on other parts of the reform agenda. Let me now turn to the interesting part of the presentation, which is the medium-term challenges. And indeed, as is reflected very much in the government of Malaysia's reform agendas, it's all about the structural medium-term challenges as Malaysia prepares itself to join the league of high-income economies by 2020. Now, imagine that somebody who doesn't know Malaysia picks up the 10 Malaysia plan, or the new economic model, or the EDP, the GDP, at a random page, for example, page 7 of the 10 Malaysia plan. Reading there, we are on a burning platform. I mean, what would this investor think? Is this an economy on the brink of default, on the brink of a crisis? Probably not. So we think it's important to put these medium-term challenges into perspective before we even start discussing the progress and the remaining challenges that are still there in terms of the reform agenda. So let's briefly look at three perspectives: a historical perspective, a counterfactual perspective, and a forward-looking perspective. Now let's apply these three different lenses to the economic agenda and the social agenda. On the economic side, if we take the historical perspective, certainly over long historical periods, Malaysia's growth story has been an absolute success story. Aggregate GDP growth has been buoyant, as the left chart shows, even though there's been a fair amount of volatility as well. The Growth Commission has identified Malaysia as one of the very few countries around the world that has, over a period of more than 25 years, registered 7% growth or more. Many developing countries at the moment look up to Malaysia to emulate those experiences. Now, let's adopt the counterfactual perspective and look at the slide on the right-hand side. Malaysia has experienced very rapid growth in aggregate incomes, but when you look at income per person, that progress has been less than spectacular. Granted, Malaysia progressed to become an upper middle income country, but relative to what perhaps could have happened, Malaysia seems to have gotten stuck in what by now has been widely publicized, a middle income trap. As I also mentioned in the presentation last time, and perhaps it's useful to just repeat that, in 1970, Korea was a third poorer than Malaysia. Now Korea is 3 times richer. And of course we have the experiences of Hong Kong and Singapore as well. So this is of course always an unfair comparison, because none of these countries are the counterfactual of Malaysia, but it does point to a large untapped potential. This is all centered around the notion of the middle income trap, and this notion is well understood, and it also lies at the very heart of Malaysia's transformation programs as well as the 10 Malaysia plan. Now let's adopt a forward-looking perspective. Given these past successes but a huge untapped potential, what can Malaysia do to tap into that potential right now? And here we would say that actually escaping the middle income trap today is probably much more difficult than it was a decade or 2 decades ago. Because nowadays, as I said, we have a very intense competition within this vibrant region for trade, for talent, and for indirect investment. There's also additional opportunities that can be reaped, which is a positive thing. But we also see that there is competition in policy frameworks. China's 12th five-year plan, for example, which was just released, I think, about a month ago, a little bit more than a month ago, is very, very similar to Malaysia's new economic model. Well, they talk about innovation, they talk about harmonious growth, which is really all about inclusiveness, and sustainability, which is, of course, perhaps an even more important issue in China because of the energy issues. So progress that will be made will be relative progress to what other countries are making. Looking at the social side, the social dimension, we can again adopt these 3 perspectives. Malaysia has historically made tremendous progress in reducing poverty, which is on the chart on the left-hand side, the dark line. Official statistics point to significant success in poverty reduction across all states in Malaysia. Between 1976 and 2009, national poverty incidence was decimated to very low levels, below 4%. Malaysia has also registered tremendous success during the 1970s and the 1980s in reducing income inequality. But again, we can adopt a counterfactual perspective. And on the income inequality chart, we can see that income inequality has remained at internationally high levels during the 90s and the noughties. Income inequality, as measured by the Gini coefficient, is higher in Malaysia than it is in Indonesia, in Vietnam, and in Thailand. Now, that has to be qualified because it's hard to compare Gini coefficients across countries. But that's what the superficial inspection of the statistics at least suggests us. The battle against poverty has also not yet been won. There are also new phases of poverty: youth poverty, elderly poverty, and urban poverty. And poverty continues to retain a very strong regional flavor. Sabah stands out with a poverty rate of close to 20% compared to a national average below 4%. Expressed in the terms of the number of poor, Sabah now attracts close to 43% of all the poor in Malaysia. And this is based on official statistics and based on the National Poverty Line Index. There are also inertial forces that entrench poverty in Malaysia. And much of this seems to be related to access to education or educational attainment issues. For example, for Malaysia as a whole, some 80% of the workforce is educated to upper secondary level or equivalent, one statistic suggests. But among the poor households, 62% of the households that are poor are headed by a person with primary education or less, and only 1% of the poor households is headed by a person with tertiary education. Now, let's adopt a forward-looking perspective. And as Malaysia becomes a high-income economy, we have to also be aware that there are probably going to be challenges emerging, new challenges. We're talking about innovation-led growth, which means skills-intensive growth as well. So the disparities between the skilled and the unskilled may increase. We talk about greater competition in the economy, which may create temporary dislocations. And we're talking about geographically concentrated growth, which will require attention to the lagging regions. So inequality is likely to rise going forward as Malaysia becomes a higher or a high-income economy, unless policy adjustments are being made. Now, let's talk about our assessment of the progress that has been made so far, and this is our independent assessment. Progress on the reform agenda, the achievements so far, but what remains to be done, and we put this in a constructive light, where we give credit where credit is due, but where we also want to point out a number of areas where progress has been less than spectacular. And we also, in doing so, reflect the views of significant and extensive consultations that we've had with investors from OECD countries and with the financial sector community in several countries. Now, with that lengthy hedge, let me first point out that given the historical successes and the large untapped potential and the likely emerging challenges looking ahead, how can Malaysia actually move ahead now, both in terms of lifting per capita income growth and fostering inclusive growth? And definitely over the last couple of years, Malaysia has been in a reform overdrive perhaps, and on the policy assessment front, a lot of progress has been made. And many of the plans and the programs and the result areas and the national, the alphabet soup of initiatives, many of these initiatives contain very frank assessments of where Malaysia is right now relative to where it wants to be. And this is a very positive development. On the policy articulation front, Malaysia has introduced novel ways to come up through bottom-up consultation with actionable policy conclusions. We're thinking here about the labs that have been organized, both for the SRIs now and for the NKEs. And the private sector has been closely involved in this, as well as government officials and international consultant teams. And this is also an impressive development. The structure of the reform agenda is also sound, according to our views. We have, on the GDP side, a focus on public service delivery. On the EDP side, we have a combination of sectoral issues and cross-cutting issues. Sectoral, the NKEs, the National Key Economic Activities, and a new economic model for the cross-cutting issues. And this really reflects the best practice way of thinking about development today. We have to think big, but we also have to think small. Thinking big about the micro-enabling environment, but thinking small about what does it mean, a bottleneck at a micro level for a particular sector. So if there's a shortage of skills, for example, what does that mean for the electronics industry? So that's also important. On the implementation front, a number of positive developments occur relating to the frameworks that have been put in place to put pressure on implementation. We have the key performance indicators approach that is putting pressure on the bureaucracy to implement. The Malaysia plan, as you pointed out, is also a rolling plan. And we also know through our consultations in Malaysia and abroad that investor sentiment has warmed up significantly on the back of the project-based approach. So investor sentiment has warmed up a lot towards the national key economic activity projects in these different sectors. But what we do have to point out, though, is that market participants remain highly skeptical about the impact of the cross-cutting reform announcements under the new economic model. And this skepticism, in our view, likely reflects two issues. One, the fact that it's just more difficult to tackle the cross-cutting issues, but also that there's been a slower progress that has been made on the NEM front. At the moment the SRI labs are happening, and the results are going to be announced pretty soon. But relative to, for example, the NKA approach, the NEM approach has been much slower to take off. In our view, it is very critical that the implementation of the new economic model is accelerated. Fixing cross-cutting issues will generate lasting growth, beyond a temporary acceleration of growth momentum based on projects. So we are concerned that we may be now in a situation in Malaysia where we see a growth acceleration on the basis of investment growth, but that this may mask actually a deterioration in underlying growth potential. Looking ahead, the choice is rather clear. If Malaysia implements the structural reforms wholeheartedly and addresses the key bottlenecks, which by now are very well understood, then it will be able to tap into a vast unrealized growth potential. This will require tackling some difficult issues, but the outcome will be that Malaysia can progress towards a high-income economy, and within a rapidly growing economy, distributional objectives can also be more easily attained. The alternative would be one where the pie of aggregate income does not grow rapidly and might even fall relative to other countries. Underlying competitiveness may be eroded amidst tense regional competition, and under these circumstances, distributional objectives will be much more difficult to achieve. Taking a long-term perspective, the choice between these two alternatives is rather clear. To sway skeptical investor sentiment, the challenge is to identify the most difficult and important issues first and to try and over-deliver on these. So let me now turn to the analytical part of our report, the brain drain. And as it will turn out, this is very much related to Malaysia's medium-term challenges. Brain drain, we define, is the migration of talent across borders. Now, talent is measured by having acquired tertiary education, which is, of course, a very limiting factor, but that's the only way of measuring brain drain. It's the only way in which the international migrant statistics present themselves. Now, the migration of talent across borders touches upon the core of Malaysia's aspiration to become a high-income nation by 2020. Human capital is the bedrock of the high-income economy. Sustained and skill-intensive growth will require talent going forward. For Malaysia to stand success in its journey towards high income, it will need to develop, attract, and retain talent. Brain drain, however, doesn't seem to square with this objective. Malaysia needs talent, but talent seems to be leaving. Now, brain drain has long been a subject of debate and controversy. The anecdotes are abundant, but few studies have actually documented the phenomenon in the Malaysian context, be it in terms of the magnitude, the impact, or the policy response. What we try to do in this report is to fill this gap and provide an updated estimate of the extent of brain drain, examine the economic impact, and suggest possible policy responses. But at the outset, it should be cautioned that the analysis of brain drain is subject to a host of complications. Quantification of the brain drain is made difficult by data discrepancies in terms of quality, availability, timeliness, and cross-border comparability. And brain drain is also very much a multifaceted aspect that transcends the narrow realm of economics. So our findings should be interpreted with these caveats keeping in mind. The report focuses on three questions. How large is the brain drain? What is the economic impact, and how can policymakers respond? Let me turn to the first of these questions and present you the results of our research first. The Malaysian diaspora is estimated at about 1 million as of 2010. The diaspora means assortment of women, men and children living overseas and who were born in Malaysia, both skilled and unskilled. The diaspora is geographically concentrated and ethnically skewed. About a third of the entire diaspora represents skilled migration, so brain drain, where skills again are proxied by tertiary education because of lack of any alternative indicators. Let me substantiate these statements. First of all, it is a bit pointless to come up with a point estimate of brain drain or of the diaspora, because there's a range of complications in measuring it. So what we actually have tried to do in our report is to be very specific about what information is available from census data, hard-coded information, and then where we have made any assumptions to deal with uncertainties, we have made that very explicit, and in the appendix of our report we have elaborated on that and provided to other researchers the full level of details so that our analysis can be improved, but at least we have something to start from. We reviewed census information from 33 countries, which is a little bit overambitious because actually the diaspora and also the brain drain is very much concentrated. But anyway, we know now that there are 79 Malaysians now with a tertiary education in Italy. It's very, very useful to know. Just to give you a flavor of the level of detail that we've gone into. Now, so as I said, we have to combine hard-coded data from census, and by the way, census data is not unproblematic either. Indeed, we have lots of information, timely information about the flow of capital across borders, but not about the flow of human capital. But let's assume that this information is relatively reliable. And we're very lucky because Singapore published the 2010 census information just a couple of months ago. So we can be comforted that our numbers reflect a reasonable update as well. Now then we have identified the known unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld likes to call them. What are the known unknowns about brain drain and the Malaysian diaspora? Well, first of all, a very simple one is we try to come up with a worldwide estimate for 2010, but not all countries like Singapore have completed the 2010 census. Now, luckily, most of the countries where the Malaysian diaspora is situated are in the OECD countries, and many of those countries have done a bi-census or have more recent information between 2000 and 2010. But some of the countries, like Brunei, only have information as of the year 2000. So what we did, we apply a very conservative growth assumption of 2.4% for the years that we don't have data on. Now, that's not an important assumption, or that's not an important known unknown. The more important known unknown is the Singaporean non-resident population. In 1980, non-residents in Singapore, these are basically people who live, work, study in Singapore, but are not citizens or are not permanent residents. The non-residents in Singapore accounted for 5% of the population. Today, 2010, that's 25%. Now, many studies that have been done, the reason why that there are many estimates around about the size of the diaspora has to do with the non-resident population of Singapore. What we did is we adopt a very conservative assumption about this. And we've highlighted these assumptions on the right-hand side. The baseline is basically, okay, let's assume that none of the non-residents in Singapore were born in Malaysia. Okay, it's obviously not realistic. But if you assume that, then the diaspora in 2010 would be some 820,000 Malaysian born overseas worldwide, including in Singapore. We could also go the other direction, and we could say 45% of them are Malaysian born. And that, we believe, is unrealistic as well. Now, why 45%? Well, if you look at the resident immigrant population in Singapore, in other words, the residents, you look at the resident population, and that's where we have information on, and you look at how many of those were foreign born. Well, 45% of them came from Malaysia. So we can apply the 45% as well to the non-residents, and then we come up with that. So it's sort of a logical approach for a minimum and a maximum. A minimum 0, a maximum 45. The World Bank's Migration and Remittances Fact Book, which is very much a worldwide estimate of migratory flows, employing top-down analysis and lacking the in-depth country information. Like our study, we're looking at doing a bottom-up approach much more. But this publication assumed 45% of the Singaporean non-residents are from Malaysia. And then you come up with a brain drain, or sorry, a diaspora estimate, skilled and unskilled, of 1.4 million. Now, we have been in close consultation with our colleagues in Washington, and these numbers are going to be revised after our detailed country study. Yeah? Now, we have also asked the Singapore Department of Statistics to give us information on the non-resident population, but that request seems to have been denied. So we assume 15%, and we think that this is a reasonable number, and that will bring the diaspora at about 1 million. So that's a little bit of a lengthy discussion, because I would like to motivate it very clearly. As I said, there are assumptions. We don't want to be pinned down by 1 million. We think it could be below that or above that. Now, we also would like to point out that whether it's 1 million or 1.2 million or even 1.4 million, it doesn't really matter so much, because we need to relate it to a number of factors. And even if we consider it's only 1 million, we will point out in later slides that this is already rather problematic. I need to go a little bit quicker. Okay, so now, just 1/3 of the previous slide, 1/3 of the overall diaspora is skilled. Yeah. So that amounts to about 300,000 people with tertiary education that have left the country. This is just a chart showing the evolution of Singapore's population, and as I said, the upper segment of the bar is the non-residents, went up from 5 to 25%. Okay, now what are some of the features? Well, first of all, if you take our most reasonable scenario 2 or 15%, and we assume that the skills profile of the residents in Singapore is the same as the skills profile of the non-residents, then you come up with the total 57% of the total diaspora is located in Singapore. 54% of the total brain drain is located in Singapore. And if you just look at the next countries, Australia, Brunei, UK, and the United States, together with Singapore, they account for 85% of the total diaspora and the total brain drain. Now, the diaspora has grown very quickly. It has almost quadrupled over the last 3 decades. But skilled migration, brain drain, has increased even more rapidly. The skilled diaspora is now 3 times larger than it was 2 decades ago. Singapore absorbed most of the brain drain, not just in terms of the total stock, which we showed was well above 50%, but also in terms of the increment. And this is a fact based on the Singapore census for 2010. Just over the last decade, close to 70% of all the skilled migration went to Singapore. And over the last decade, the skilled diaspora in Singapore has grown at a yearly rate of 6%, which is well above the estimated growth rates for other destinations. Now, the rapid rate of increase in skilled migration in brain drain to Singapore is explained by changing patterns of skill intensity. If you look at Singapore over there, and you see we have the number for 2010, but not for these other countries. The share of skilled people compared to the total number of Malaysian born in that particular country was only 10% in 1990. It was 23% in 2000 and 35% in 2010. Now, interestingly, Singapore, Brunei, and to some extent also the UK, the skill share is much lower than the skill shares of these other OECD countries or OECD countries. New Zealand, USA, Australia, Canada, which, as I said, together account for most of the phenomenon. So migration to OECD countries is much more skill intensive. But interestingly, there seems to have been a degree of convergence. Migration to Singapore is becoming increasingly skilled migration, and this is likely to continue. So we would expect that the brain drain from Malaysia is likely to intensify rather than to to slow down in the absence of mitigating policies. Now, what is the economic impact of brain drain? It's fine to talk about a number, but what does it mean? How significant is it? Well, first of all, the brain drain in Malaysia is aggravated by the narrow skill base and by the lack of compensating inflows of skilled individuals, skilled immigrants. But brain drain by itself doesn't need to trap a country into a vicious cycle of human capital flight and slow growth. Contrary to popular belief, brain drain can also bring benefits. Some of these benefits may not be immediately visible, but over time they may turn detrimental brain drain into beneficial brain drain. The possibility of migration can also promote skills formation domestically. The fact that you think one day you might migrate may incentivize you to take up tertiary education, and then eventually not everybody leaves, so that benefits the domestic skill base. The existence of a diaspora can also be positive for the exchange of goods, capital and ideas, and there may be some potentially very large untapped benefits for Malaysia here. By and large, we think that the brain drain for Malaysia has contributed to the erosion of an already narrow skill base. Let me develop these points rather quickly. First of all, what does it mean a third of the total diaspora is skilled, and the total diaspora was around 1 million? Well, the point is that the brain drain, when you relate it to the domestic skill base, the number of people here with tertiary education, the brain drain is extremely intense. In 2000, which is we only have comparable cross-country information for 1990 and 2000, so let me take 2000. 1 out of 10 Malaysians with a tertiary degree ended up at one point in an OECD country. Now this is a little bit deceptive, because remember how we measure brain drain? We look at the census information, for example, in the United States, and we count the number of people who have a tertiary degree. It may be the case that these people got the tertiary degree after migrating to the United States. And indeed, we have evidence that for Malaysia this is very important. Many people leave and then get their education elsewhere. But leaving that caveat aside, 1 out of 10 Malaysians with a tertiary degree left to an OECD country, which is double the world average. But it's well below what we see in some of the other countries. In Singapore and Hong Kong, it was much higher. But if you include Singapore, because Singapore is not an OECD country, if you include the migration to Singapore, suddenly the numbers for Malaysia shoot up. And I should say that then also the chart becomes not comparable, because we don't do the same thing for the other countries. But if we do that, then 2 out of 10 Malaysians with a tertiary degree in the end ended up in another country. So also, the brain drain does not seem to be alleviated by the compensating inflow of skilled migrants. Malaysia is a major receiving country. It's a major sending country as well, but even more a receiving country. But most immigrants are low-skilled immigrants. On the left, we see the share of immigrants in total employment, rather high. And this is just a documented immigration. On the right-hand side, we see the skill profile of immigrants. This is people with no formal education and people with just primary education. If you add them up, 60% of the immigrants have lower than primary education. And we will also make an observation about the high-skill expatriate base later on. So brain drain does not perhaps appear to have eroded the number of people available in Malaysia with a tertiary degree, because at the same time universities continue to replenish the outflows very quickly. But it certainly has moderated the increase in the skills base, and that's problematic given where Malaysia wants to be, a high-income economy where growth is skill intensive. But brain drain is also likely to have eroded the quality of the human capital stock. As anywhere else around the world, brain drain is prone to positive selection. The best and the brightest typically leave first. But given the narrow skills base in Malaysia, this is particularly worrisome. And these concerns are very much picked up in our analysis of labor markets and surveys of investment climates. It takes a long time in Malaysia for employers to find those with the right skill set. And even if the vacancies get filled, it appears that employers also remain dissatisfied about the quality of the skills of their employees, and we present some evidence here. Now, of course, brain drain is not the only factor that affects quality, but it is likely to have been, nevertheless, an important one. Let me now turn to the policy dimension. How can we address the brain drain? And maybe a rather tacky phrase, but brain drain is a wave to be ridden and not a tide to be turned. Brain drain reflects the forces of globalization that are making the world a smaller place, and it's certainly not unique to Malaysia. And neither is it avoidable or to be avoided. And the challenge for Malaysia, as for many other countries around the world, is to embrace the global mobility of talent, not to stop it. As Malaysia needs talent, it will need to turn the brain drain to its advantage. It will need to reverse the deterioration in skill quality, or the impact of brain drain, the negative impact of brain drain on skill quality, and also expand the narrow skill base. So now brain drain is a symptom of underlying factors. It's not a problem by itself. To address the brain drain at its root, we advocate that the brain drain is addressed comprehensively by tackling the root causes of brain drain, which have to do with productivity and inclusiveness. Targeted policies, such as those pursued by Talent Corporation, wake up, Johan, facilitate the flow of talent, and these are very welcome steps, but they also need to be evaluated against the progress that is made on the comprehensive agenda. So, let me develop these points very briefly. Brain drain is a symptom and not a problem by itself. It's an outcome of underlying factors, and individuals respond to incentives and disincentives, the push and the pull factors that drive the migration decision. Identifying these constitutes the first step to formulating policies. We did a small, modest survey of about 200 people of the diaspora. It's a very small sample size. There's been studies with larger sample sizes. But we would very much encourage the government to improve this work. And we would like to use this as an illustration rather than any definite answer. 80% of our sample were respondents of Chinese ethnicity. 50% were younger than 25. 50% were between 25 and 40. I would say that the fact that we have only interviewed 200 people is a problem. The fact that 80% of them are of Chinese ethnicity is not so much a problem, because as I will show later, the brain drain in the diaspora is a strongly ethnic dimension, and 80% is not necessarily unrepresentative of that number. The fact that the sample is very much geared towards younger people is, I think, a strength, because younger people who have presumably not been such a long time outside of Malaysia may also have a stronger tendency to come back, and this is picked up in our survey. Now, in this survey, some 66% of respondents considered among the top 3 reasons career prospects as an important one. 54% compensation. So these are the economic incentives. But 60% quoted a sense of social injustice related to Malaysia's inclusiveness policies as a push factor. So, if we accept that the economic incentives have to do with productivity differences and the social justice factors have to do with inclusiveness, I need to wrap up. Then the policy response would also address exactly productivity and inclusiveness. Now, we know that productivity growth has slowed down after the Asian crisis. Productivity agenda is very well understood in Malaysia. It's in the economic transformation program. And forceful implementation of these programs should assist in strengthening both the demand and the supply sides for the market for talent, so that productivity and wages can increase. Now, how to do this? Well, we need to work both on the supply side, supply for skills, and here we show some indicators that can be improved, mathematics, science, but there are other indicators that Malaysia could consider, and Malaysia would do well to participate in the PISA studies. So addressing the supply side by improving the education system would help the productivity agenda, and of course also in the demand side we can talk about measures to promote innovation, where access to finance seems to be a critical issue, and measures to improve the process of internal competition within Malaysia's economy, which seems to be an important issue as well. Now, second comprehensive measure is strengthening inclusiveness. Meritocracy issues and unequal access to scholarships are perceived by the diaspora as key push factors. This push factor fuels the incentive to leave and also serves as a deterrent to come back. The non-Bumi Putera communities are significantly overrepresented in Malaysia's diaspora and the brain drain, and if you wish to address the brain drain comprehensively, some attention will be required to that. The One Malaysia program has put in place a roadmap towards promoting unity and diversity, but the litmus tests eventually of these initiatives will be whether the non-Bumi Puteras who have left Malaysia will return to Malaysia. Now, once the enablers, and this is my last slide, once the enablers are in place, targeted measures are helpful to further facilitate the flow of talent and engage with the diaspora in other ways than through the physical flow of people. However, these targeted measures cannot substitute for more comprehensive approaches outlined earlier. Talent Corp is developing new initiatives and has developed recent measures such as the Residence Pass and the Returning Experts program, and these are very encouraging developments. As Malaysia needs talent, it will also need to attract more skilled labor from abroad. As the chart suggests, however, the base of high-skilled expatriates in Malaysia has not increased, but it has fallen by 25% since 2004. Now, this of course has to be put in perspective. There was a crisis, and we see that much of the fall was triggered by manufacturing, from 17,000 people to 7,000, and half of the Japanese population in Malaysia has left since 2004. So it must be something related to the MNCs. The challenge going forward will also be to find effective ways to connect with the diaspora, which is quite difficult to do because it may be easy to raise interest from the diaspora, but much more difficult to sustain it. An immediate example of engaging with the diaspora might be to seek the diaspora's input on how Malaysia can make a leap forward towards embracing the globalization of talent and turning the brain drain to its favor. This is the end of the presentation. The report can be downloaded from the internet here. We also have a press release on it on the internet and a blog. And we also have copies available outside if you'd like to take one. Thank you so much. And that's where the human capital agenda comes in, and where the demand for skilled labor and the supply of skilled labor plays an important role. Now, this topic that you just mentioned, we analyzed exactly a year ago in our monitor on growth through innovation. But what you point out is exactly right at the beginning. The issues are very well known, and we're certainly not claiming to put very new things on the table. I think the main purpose of our report is to put things in perspective and to encourage the implementation of the difficult structural reforms. To keep the Q&A on the short side, so let's do the questions quickly.
Hi, Alan from Afin. My question is on the export competitiveness. We know that ringgit has strengthened against the dollar. Just want to hear your view how the strong ringgit would have an impact on Malaysia's competitiveness. The second question is, we know that a strong ringgit would discourage tourists, but the strong ringgit will attract foreign talent from coming back to Malaysia. Thank you.
On the second point, I would say yes, because economic incentives will be diminished, the differences. On the first question, mixed answer. Well, first of all, in this comparison across countries, we've seen currency appreciation throughout the region. So many countries have to deal with this. This has been a result of the global imbalances. Secondly, Malaysia's manufacturing sector is dominated, the export-oriented manufacturing sector is dominated by multinational companies that import large quantities of intermediate inputs in capital goods and so on. And then they process assembly-based manufacturing, and then they export the final products or intermediate products to the rest of the world. So exchange rate appreciation has a more limited impact on export competitiveness than, let's say, the more exporters that produce the product entirely domestically and rely less on intermediate inputs. But it is indeed very well possible that the appreciation of the ringgit has affected the competitiveness in Malaysia, particularly because it occurred rather rapidly. But on the other hand, I would say that currency appreciation is also a good thing, because I mean, Tan Sri Young will disagree with me, but it may put pressure on entrepreneurs to really keep costs under control. Now, that's a bit like running with what did you call it again? With a brick on your feet, you know, why make it even more difficult for entrepreneurs to do that? But this could be another factor to be considered.
Just to add that if you take a longer-term perspective, currency appreciation in the long term reflects success in the economy. It reflects growing productivity, and that you are not competing in the low-wage segment of the market. So over the long term, we hope, and you should hope, that Malaysia's currency appreciates, because it means that you will gradually be moving up the income chain. In the short, even when it raises legitimate questions in the short term.
My name is Sadia from Malaysia Economic Monitor. I'd like to ask two questions. One is in relation to the poverty rate that you have shown on the slide on the various states in Malaysia. To me, a lot of the information that is given are new information to me. Like, for example, we have been used to think that some of the poorest countries, or those states with highest poverty rates, are Kelantan and Terengganu, and here from your study that interestingly Kelantan is not the poorest state, and that Perak is quite high in terms of the poverty rate, and that Sabah has got 40%, which is almost an outlier. So my question is, are these nationally produced figures, or was that an independent survey done to establish the poverty rate? And my other question is also, it's interesting to note that the reasons for leaving, the two highest factors are career prospects and social injustice. And that compensation is the third reason, which is 4%. And you also, on one of the slides, mentioned about the need for frank assessments. And you also mentioned about significant changes to be made to having frank assessments. If you could elaborate on what you mean by significant changes that have been made, and also how do you think the events that have been happening around the world in terms of pro-democracy and the views for the younger people that need to be taken, how much do you think these trends around the world would influence on the ability of the government to engage a more democratic engagement with the people? Thank you.
Okay, so on your first question, the statistics are from the Economic Planning Unit, and this is based on the household income surveys. So these are official statistics provided by the EPU. Now, it is true that this is new information. It hasn't been published before. It wasn't in the 10 Malaysia plan. It's for 2009. But this is the latest information that is now available on poverty in Malaysia from the national authorities. What you mentioned, the 43% for Sabah, should not be misinterpreted. It's 43% of the national poor are located in Sabah. But the poverty incidence rate, which is the number of people below the poverty line as a share of total population in Sabah, is much lower. It's around 20%. I forgot the number now. Okay, that's one point. And your second question, if you look at income inequality in Malaysia, which is now really the major issue, it's no longer so much poverty in the aggregate, even though there's new phases of poverty and poverty continues to persist in concentrated pockets like in Sabah, right? But by and large, one would say that income inequality is issue number one now. 94% of income inequality today is a function of differences within ethnic groups rather than between ethnic groups. Now that wasn't always the case like that. But today, 94% of inequality is a function of, do you have a job or you don't have a job? Do you live in the countryside or in the city? What is your level of educational attainment? Remember I mentioned that among the poor households, only 1% of the household has tertiary education. So the face of inequality is now different than it used to be 3-4 decades ago. This suggests that there is a need for Malaysia to update its inclusiveness policies in order to book further success in reducing inequality, particularly because we think inequality is likely to rise as Malaysia becomes a high-income nation. So to update the inclusiveness policies on the factors that really account for the inequality, that determine low income, that determine poverty, rather than broad aggregates such as ethnicity. By targeting these more refined determinants, or by targeting better the inclusiveness policies, in the end you will, continue to help approximately the same people, because many of the Malay bumi puteras are indeed still located in the countryside, and as well many of the non-Malay bumi puteras. Many of them may have educational qualifications that are slightly lower. So in the end, you continue to achieve more or less the same thing. There's nothing new in what I'm saying. This is also reflected in the new economic model. But this is what we are suggesting, is to, since the determinants of inequality and poverty have changed, focus on those new determinants. And that will also help in mitigating the push factors of migration, particularly of skilled migration, because Malaysia needs talent. The talent seems to be leaving. I'm afraid, we can maybe take one more question, but I probably spoke as usual for too long, but in our report you will find our contact details, and we're more than happy to continue the dialogue. You can send an email or you can set up a phone call or whatever. So please continue asking questions, and also good for us to listen to what you have to say. So maybe one final question, please.
If I may, Malaysia is a country with very low salaries in the manufacturing sector, in the service sector, 600, 700 ringgit per month. It's a country without a minimum wage. It's a country with subsidies, state subsidies for a whole list of products, fuel, energy, various staple goods for daily consumption. What is the World Bank recommending to the government on the minimum wage, particularly, which I assume is one of the structural reforms that you see vital for the country's development towards a high income status? The government has been considering a very gradual approach, a selective approach, sector by sector, even geographic approach, peninsula versus eastern Malaysia. Is that workable according to you, or is there a need for a more shock type of approach to this whole problem? My name is Citizen Piquet. I'm the ambassador of the EU in Malaysia.
Okay. Well, the first question is why a minimum wage, and then the second question is, if you want to have a minimum wage, how do you design it? And we have, indeed, the World Bank has been running a minimum wage law in collaboration with the government. It has been a public event, so you may have heard some of the announcements already, but we haven't at the same time come up with firm conclusions, because in a way there are no firm conclusions, and the parameters will be a political decision. But let me tell you what we do know and what we have advocated. First of all, why a minimum wage? What is the objective? Is the objective poverty reduction? Is the objective moving up the value chain, forcing companies to employ less low-skilled labor, and by doing that, forcing automation and pushing up wages so that companies automate more? Or is it something else? Well, we think that the minimum wage is not the right instrument for poverty reduction. Because firms at the moment have low levels of productivity. By pushing up the minimum wage, you either increase informality or you cause multinational companies to move abroad, or you cause unemployment because firms are going bust because they cannot afford the minimum wage. The minimum wage is also not an instrument to move up the value chain. There are other instruments for that. Yeah? I've discussed those in my presentation, where you work on the demand side, fiscal supply side. Pulling up wages may be more effective than pushing them up in that respect. Now, there is one area where the minimum wage is very useful, and that is in cases where there is distorted bargaining power in the labor market. You have an uncompetitive labor market. For example, Sam Darby has many estates, and Indian workers on those estates earn 400 ringgit per month, right? One could say that there may be the employer has a lot of bargaining power. In cases like that, introducing a minimum wage can increase employment at the same time as wage levels. But there is eventually it will go down again. So it's very tricky. So we do think there is a role for the minimum wage, but perhaps not for the reasons that many people are thinking, because there are other better instruments. Then the second part of your question is, how do we implement it? Ideally, once you think we should have a minimum wage, we should have a single minimum wage for every single worker, depending on your productivity. That's of course impossible. So and you have mobility between states. So in practice, practical solution would be to have a national reference rate and then adjust it according to groups of states. And perhaps one natural distinction would be Peninsular Malaysia and Sabah separately, because the mobility of labor is also rather limited. But there's a whole set of design issues about, once you accept that we need a minimum wage, how do we actually implement it? It's a very tricky issue. What is also very important is the level of the minimum wage. As I said, firm productivity levels are rather low in Malaysia. So you have to be very careful not to set it too high, or it will be counterproductive. You push people into poverty, and you will not achieve the productivity objectives that people might be thinking of achieving.
Just to add on, the worldwide experience tends to be that both the shock approach and a gradual approach can work or fail. So it depends very much in the country's circumstance on what is likely to be implemented and sustained. And that, I think, is still an open question here.
Thank you very much. All right. Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Verghese and Mr. Shalakan.